The Sword of Shannara. I mentioned this book briefly when I reviewed Shadow of the Conqueror, and since people seem to like me doing book reviews, I figured I'd give this one a proper review, because it deserves one. But not exactly in a good way. You ever want to read Lord of the Rings without actually reading Lord of the Rings? I mean, let's face it, it's very difficult for the average modern ADD-addled brain to handle all those elvish songs and Tom Bombadils and waxing poetic over the history of every tree and piece of stone. Well, nowadays, you can just pop in Peter Jackson's epic movie adaptation. But back in the late 70s, your options were more limited. You could check out Ralph Bakshi's 1978 animated film, but that left the story unfinished. Or you could read Terry Brooks' 1977 novel, The Sword of Shannara, aka Lord of the Rings, the abridged version. The Sword of Shannara is kind of a weird artifact of the times. I don't think a writer could get away with a book like this being their first novel in the age of the internet. Instead of a springboard for a prolific fantasy career, I think it would have been torn to pieces by Tolkien fans, and Brooks would have carried a stigma as the guy who wrote that rip-off novel. The Shannara setting is definitely a Tolkien-inspired fantasy setting. Pulling from medieval European mythology, there are dwarves and elves, no hobbits. The main character is actually a half-elf. This is certainly not unusual for the time. Brooks actually distinguishes his setting from other fantasy authors by making the Shannara setting a sort of backdoor post-apocalyptic sci-fi. The world used to be a lot more technologically advanced and is heavily implied to have once been modern Earth. Then it was destroyed in a nuclear war, and the races like dwarves basically mutated and evolved to become distinct from humans, while ancient magic was also rediscovered. It's an interesting idea, although it's not really relevant at all in this book. What really makes The Sword of Shannara egregious compared to other fantasy novels of the time that were drawing inspiration from Tolkien as well is the plot. There are some cosmetic changes and the book is heavily streamlined to make everything fit in one novel, but the plot of The Sword of Shannara is almost a point-for-point copy of the plot of The Lord of the Rings. If you think I'm just being a hater, I read this book when I was really young, before the Lord of the Rings movies came out, and before I'd read anything by Tolkien except The Hobbit. I enjoyed it a lot, and I read both of the sequels too. The Shannara trilogy is actually quite nostalgic for me, but let's call a spade a spade. I'll go over the plot briefly and people can decide for themselves if I'm being unfair. Shia Omsford and his adopted brother Flick are naive young men who live in the rustic, isolated village of Shadyvale, ignorant of the growing evil in the outside world. The two are visited by a druid named Alanon, who informs Shia that he's actually the last surviving heir of an elf king, which means that he's the last person in the world who can wield the Sword of Shannara, a magical weapon that can kill the Warlock Lord who's returned to conquer the world after disappearing for hundreds of years. Alanon gives Shia some magic stones, then leaves and warns Shia that he needs to flee the village when he sees the sign of a skull. A brief time skip later, Shia and his brother are attacked by one of the Warlock Lord's servants, a winged black monster man wearing a skull pendant. Thanks to the magic stones, the two are able to defeat the Skullbearer and escape the village. After hooking up with another friend in a neighboring town, they eventually reunite with Alanon and an assortment of warriors who join them on their quest to get the magic sword and defeat the Warlock Lord, including a token dwarf and a prince named Balinor. The Knot Fellowship sets out on their quest, but when they get to the place where the sword is supposed to be, it's not there. The party then splits. Most of the members go south to help fight the Warlock Lord's army, but first they have to deal with Balinor's brother, who's taken over the throne and has been drugged and brainwashed by his evil advisor. Shia follows the sword north into the Skull Kingdom, where everything is dead and corrupted because of the Warlock Lord's evil magic, all the way to the Warlock Lord's Skull Fortress of Skull Mountain. Shia meets a couple of new allies on his journey, and also encounters a gnome named Oral Fane. Oral Fane is the epitome of what's wrong with this book. He's basically Gollum, but because of changes Brooks made to the story, which until now haven't affected the plot at all really, Gollum in his story doesn't make sense. Unlike the One Ring, the Sword of Shannara isn't an evil, corrupting magical artifact. In fact, its magic isn't even active until the very end of the book, and the sword isn't even that fancy looking, since the heroes can't even pick it out of a pile at one point. But Oral Thane becomes completely obsessed with it, for no apparent reason, and also goes completely insane for no apparent reason. Even when I read this as a kid with no knowledge of Lord of the Rings, Oral Thane stood out to me as a character who didn't work. I didn't understand why his behavior was so weird. The sniveling, animalistic nature of Gollum in Lord of the Rings makes sense because he's been corrupted by evil magic and living in a cave for an extremely long time. Oral Thane is a deserter from the army who was a functional member of society until like a week ago. Yet he's been reduced to whimpering and trying to bite people all the time for basically no reason. He's just there as a deus ex machina to cause the final confrontation between Shia and the Warlock Lord, and unlike in Lord of the Rings, he gets no redemption. The final confrontation with the Warlock Lord actually has what I think is the book's coolest original idea. It turns out the Sword of Shannara's power is actually to reveal the truth about anything it touches, and the reason it destroys the Warlock Lord is because he was already dead. All those hundreds of years ago, the Warlock Lord tried to make himself immortal, but it actually wasn't possible, so what he really did was create basically a magic illusion that he was still alive, his decayed corpse surrounded with magical energies running warlocklord.exe. So when the sword touches the Warlock Lord and reveals the truth, he poofs out of existence. It would have been nicer if the book had done more with this theme of truth and lies, but I do still really like the concept. So yeah, I just spoiled the ending, but come on, nobody thought the Warlock Lord was going to win. So was I too harsh when I said this is almost a point-for-point copy of Lord of the Rings? I don't think so. As a little side note, there was a 2-season TV show called The Shannara Chronicles that ran from 2016 to 2017, and the creators were pretty clearly trying to distance it from Tolkien comparisons as much as possible. This is the Warlock Lord in the TV series, whereas in the book, he's described as looking a lot closer to this. Is the Sword of Shannara worth reading today? Only if you really do want to read Lord of the Rings without actually reading Lord of the Rings. Yeah, there are a few original ideas here, some of which Brooks would expand in later novels, but so much of it is a rehash that it offers very little to anyone already familiar with Tolkien's work. On the other hand, it does move at a much more brisk pace than Lord of the Rings, so for people who find Tolkien's writing difficult because they really wish he'd just get to the point, this book might be a more enjoyable read. But most of those people would probably rather just watch the movies. Peter Jackson kinda made the Sword of Shannara redundant when he delivered Lord of the Rings to the masses in an even more easily digestible form. Fortunately, Brooks's next novel, while still a very conventional fantasy quest story, would be far more original than this one. But that's a different book for a different day. If you liked the video, be sure to leave a like. If you have any thoughts or memories about the Sword of Shannara or the rest of the Shannara series, please share them in the comments section. And of course, subscribe and click the notification bell icon to see more. You can also subscribe on BitChute to watch videos early, or on Odyssey. You can read Chapter 1 of my webcomic at the link down below. Thanks everyone, and have a great day.